In a cold stone chamber at Schönbrunn Palace, behind silk-draped doors and a locked gate, a child was born to royalty and erased from history. His name was Prince Johann Leopold, firstborn son to Archduchess Maria Theresa of Austria. But he would never wear a crown. Why? Because he was born with Down syndrome. Within hours, the palace's golden halls carried whispers of shame, not celebration. The court physician noted his slanted eyes and flattened facial features. The empress turned pale. Servants were ordered to stay silent. Only a priest and 2 midwives witnessed the moment he disappeared, not by death but by design. He was sent away to a hospice outside Vienna, renamed, and forbidden from ever revealing his lineage. Can you imagine? Born into dynastic power, yet condemned to live in shadows merely for how he looked. This was not mercy. This was monarchy's darkest obsession, perfection at any cost. And it was not just Austria. Across Europe, royal children with visible disabilities became state secrets. In the gilded courts of Prussia, a young prince born in silence was never baptized publicly. A daughter of a French king vanished from records after her 3rd birthday. Britain hid its own bloodline heartbreak in plain sight. In 1905, Princess Katherine and Nerissa Bowes-Lyon, nieces to Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, were quietly institutionalized in the Royal Earlswood Hospital. Official registries marked them as deceased, while they were very much alive, sedated, isolated, stripped of titles and language itself. Their crime? Being born with Down syndrome. No palace walls were thick enough to muffle the cries of innocence betrayed. Over decades, these children were not merely hidden, they were unpersoned. Do you hear the silence behind their stories? That is the sound of a dynasty choosing image over kin, and that choice echoes, even now. In Buckingham Palace, hidden behind velvet drapes and gilded portraits, decisions were made that would shatter any notion of royal compassion. As the world watched the coronation of kings and queens, Nerissa and Katherine sat forgotten just 17 miles away, in rooms where the windows barely opened. Nurses were forbidden to mention their family name. News never came. No letters. No visitors. Their birthdays passed like waves in the dark, silent, unacknowledged. And yet, for decades, the official royal biographies listed them as deceased. Imagine that. Still breathing, still blinking, but erased. When the truth surfaced in 1987, decades after they were committed, public shock was met with royal silence. No apology, no reckoning, just the whir of history trying to sweep them back under the rug. But the world had already seen and remembered. These weren't isolated fates. They were reflections of a brutal pattern, repeated and refined. When royalty encountered imperfection, it buried it beneath stone and silence. In 1940s Germany, under the looming shadow of fascism, even nobility was not spared the iron grip of eugenics. Princess Alexandrine of Prussia, born in 1915 with what was likely Down syndrome, lived in a quiet estate, far from Berlin's stern gazes. Her family, once proud heirs of the Kaiser's lineage, locked her away behind lace curtains and cobwebbed corridors. She received no formal education, no debutante ball, no mention in the family annals. In a regime obsessed with genetic purity, her life became a quiet protest against an unforgiving world. She wasn't sent to the gas chambers, but she lived with the knowledge that a different political wind could have sealed her fate. Her silence wasn't chosen, it was enforced. And while bombs fell and borders shifted, she remained a living reminder of what power tries hardest to erase, that humanity, in all its forms, refuses to fit inside crowns or cages. But what about the stories we never found? The royal infants whose names were never recorded, whose cries were silenced before they even echoed beyond nursery walls. In the Vatican archives, in musty backrooms of European chateaux, rumors linger of birth records altered, midwives silenced with gold, entire lifelines snipped from dynastic trees before ink ever touched the family register. Some were rumored to have fallen ill suddenly, others sent to the countryside for rest, never to return. The euphemisms were endless: frailty, insanity, divine testing. But beneath the lace and lies was always the same fear, that the visage of the divine right to rule might be cracked by the vulnerability of a child's face. And so the charade continued. Portraits were repainted, medical papers vanished, historians left with only scars and whispers. Behind every majestic coronation, behind the anthems and oaths, was an unspoken question: how many royal children simply disappeared? Not all parents were complicit. Some royal mothers fought, quietly, to keep their children close. Queen Maria II of Portugal whispered lullabies to her son Miguel, a boy born with clear developmental delays, long after her advisors pressured her to send him away. She refused at first. For months she nursed him in private wings, guarded by loyal attendants sworn to secrecy. But the whispers grew louder. Cabinet members called it a threat to national stability. Her ministers spoke in soft tones about dignity and continuity. Eventually, even she yielded. Miguel vanished from court. The pages of history turned without him. His mother never smiled in portraits again. This moment repeats itself, over and over. The tender war between love and legacy, between bloodline and burden, and always, it is the child who loses, hidden so the world might forget. But they were here. They breathed, hoped, hurt. And their silence isn't the absence of sound, it's the presence of shame. Even into the modern era, the shadows linger. In 2003, amid the pristine grounds of Sweden's royal estate, a nurse anonymously claimed a child, born to the extended Bernadotte family, had been institutionalized at birth due to visible chromosomal anomalies. The palace vehemently denied it. No evidence surfaced. But once more, the contours of an old pattern emerged: secrecy, denial, silence. Across cultures and generations, royal bloodlines have wrapped themselves in a robe of illusion, hiding what they deemed unfit for the gaze of history. But history sees anyway. Its torch flickers in forgotten ledgers, in blurred photographs, in the empty spaces where names should be. And if you listen closely to the gaps, the redactions, the forged smiles, you'll hear a question echo through time: what is the price of perfection? For too many royal children, that answer was their very existence. Not broken, not monstrous, just unseen. Their lives were not failures, but forgetting them is. Now we must sit with that silence. It stretches between centuries and crowns, between lullabies silenced too soon and portraits that never were. These children were not anomalies, they were heirs, siblings, sons, and daughters. And yet, their existence was treated as an illness, their presence a flaw in the grand architecture of sovereignty. What monstrous god requires the denial of a child to uphold his throne? The question haunts castle walls, whispered through marble halls and flickering candlelight. Truth cuts quieter than swords, and in that truth lies reckoning. These stories, the erased, the hidden, the renamed, are more than tragedy. They are testimony. Imperfect, yes, but human. And no dynasty built on silence will stand forever intact. One day, even the thickest tapestries must unravel. We will remember them not as mistakes of royal design, but as lives, as pulses, as souls. They were born into the world, even if history tried not to notice. Their names may be lost, their images erased, but their truth still shimmers behind every manicured lineage and polished family crest. Each one left a fragile fingerprint on the timetables of dynasties that sought to forget them. In remembering, we reclaim what power tried to bury: a fuller, flawed, human history. Let it mar the perfection. Let it disrupt the myth. These children were not blemishes on royal hearts. They were mirrors held up to regimes obsessed with illusion. And if you stand still long enough, you might feel them lingering in the hush between royal proclamations, behind the eyes of portraits too perfect to be real. Their silence still speaks. Their lives still matter, not as royal cautionary tales, but as whispers of truth the world wasn't ready to hold. But we are. We hold them now in memory, in honor, in defiance of forgetting. The crown is heavy, but so is conscience. Imagine the coronation of a future monarch, spotlights glowing, crowds cheering, history in the making. But somewhere in the footnotes of forgotten ledgers sits another name, faded and struck through, a sibling perhaps, born with Down syndrome, whose face never graced a balcony wave or postage stamp, whose toys were taken, not by time, but by decree. The future of royalty seems unwavering, gleaming with ceremony and certainty. But beneath its surface lie the unspoken costs of appearances maintained through absence. We inherit the majesty, but also the legacy of denial. These children did not fail their families failed them. And as their stories arise from silence, they confront us with a reckoning long overdue, not just in palaces, but in every home where shame has tried to silence difference. History cannot resurrect them, but it can do what royalty would not. It can see them, speak them, and finally acknowledge they were royal too. In dusty archives and beneath frescoed ceilings, the final threads of this painful legacy still dangle, waiting for witness. Not all records were burned. Not all memories died in silence. A diary entry here, a torn photograph there, a surviving nurse, trembling, speaking late in life of a special child who never left the nursery wing. The tragedy lies not only in these children's concealment, but in what their stories reveal about us. Our fears, our hunger for flawlessness, our cruelty in the name of legacy. For every erased name, there are thousands more outside palatial walls who suffered similar fates. But if even the highest bloodlines could not protect their most vulnerable, what hope did others have? This is not just a royal story. It is a reflection of a world shaped by standards no child should ever have to meet. And so we end not with closure, but with a mirror. What do we choose to hide, and why? A mirror that does not flatter, but reveals. It shows us a lineage of choices made in panic, in pride, in fear. These were not isolated acts of cruelty cloaked in royal protocol. They were systemic, deliberate, and devastating. Dresses sewn that were never worn, thrones carved for heirs who would never sit. In every era, the pattern repeated: silence over discomfort, abandonment over acceptance. And yet, to look away now would be to choose their erasure all over again. So let this be the final page of their unwritten chapters, a vow not to excuse, but to expose, to grieve, and to grow. The tragic fate of royal children born with Down syndrome is not only a relic of monarchic flaw, but a signal flare in the fog of collective denial. Let us not turn the page too quickly. Linger here, feel it, because remembering is not weakness, and silence, no matter how regal, never sanctifies injustice. And so we are left standing in two worlds, one robed in silk, the other wrapped in silence. Royal histories love their heroes, their conquests, their continuity, but what they feared most was not treachery or war, it was imperfection. A child born with Down syndrome shattered the illusion of divine infallibility. But maybe, just maybe, that's where the truth begins. In the beauty of what doesn't fit, in the courage of what was hidden. These children, denied even the dignity of memory, remind us that power without compassion is just a pageant of shadows. Their stories are not just historical footnotes. They are open wounds across our collective conscience. Our silence too has consequences. And so we end not with a flourish, but with a plea not for pity but for presence. They were here, they mattered, and through the cracks in the crown, a fuller light now shines. A history less polished, but finally, more human. In this fractured light, we begin to see them not as forgotten footnotes, but as vital threads in the fabric of our collective past. They were not meant to be footnotes at all, but verses unspoken, unfinished, but still resonant. Their stifled voices rise not in vengeance, but in vindication. From Johann Leopold's banishment to the whispered lullabies of Queen Maria, from Nerissa and Katherine's shuttered rooms to Alexandrine's lonely estate, each moment composes a requiem long overdue, because to acknowledge them is more than remembrance, it is resistance, against shame, against historical amnesia, against the myth that only perfection is worthy of legacy. So if history is to mean anything more than gold filigree and heraldic pride, then let it begin here, in the quiet naming of those once unnamed, in the soft echo of lives denied the spotlight, yet never lacking in light. Their truth endures, not beneath the crown but beyond it. As the curtain falls on these vanished lives, what remains is not just sorrow, but a summons. These children, silenced by pedigree and prejudice, form the unseen backbone of a royal legacy rewritten by omission. But in drawing them from the shadows, we do not only restore their place in history, we remake history itself, one in which value is not measured by symmetry or succession, but by presence, by breath, by being. Their existence is an indictment of glorified traditions built on the burial of truth. And in witnessing them now, even in fragments and faded rumors, we whisper a defiance that rings louder than any royal decree. You were here. You were loved, perhaps not by those closest, but now, by those who finally see. This is not a eulogy, it's an awakening, for them, for us, for the kind of world that bows not to crowns, but to the dignity of every life imperfect, and therefore fully human. And perhaps that is the truest form of royalty, not inherited by blood or sealed by decree, but earned through our capacity to remember those cast aside. These children, stripped of titles but never of worth, haunt the corridors of forgetting, insisting softly that history must widen its lens. Let their stories be the key that unlocks every closed archive, the whisper that unsettles every polished legacy. We carry their memory not as burden but as compass, so when the annals of kings and queens are retold, let their names slip through. Let truth leak, quiet and steady, like light through cracked, stained glass. Because in the end, what crowns endure are not those forged in gold, but those etched in courage, the courage to embrace imperfection, to hold space for every life, however brief, however hidden. Their silence was once our shame, but now their memory becomes our responsibility, and through that, they reign finally, and forever, seen. Their reign begins not with trumpets, but with testimony. We speak their names, even when records do not. We hold space where portraits should hang, and in that sacred act of remembrance, we crown them not with jewels, but with justice. Let every genealogy rewritten include their shadow. Let every dynasty reckon with the children it hid, for power that excludes vulnerability is power unworthy of reverence, and the silence once imposed by royal decree is breaking, thread by golden thread. One final truth settles among the cobwebbed palaces and shuttered wings. These were not forgotten children, they were forcibly erased. But now, across time and bloodlines, they return not in shame, but in honor. We cannot undo the choices that banished them, but we can choose, today, to bring them back into the light, and in doing so write the history they never received, not framed in myth, but alive in memory, whole, human, royal. So let this be their coronation, not of pomp and procession, but of remembrance and reckoning, no fanfare, no balcony wave, just truth, stepping quietly into the light. We place no crown upon their heads, but we lift the veil history cast over them. In the silence where lies once lingered, their stories now sing fragile, fierce, unrelenting, because in the end, the greatest tribute we can offer is not correction but connection, to look upon the gaps, the shadows, and say, you were never too different to be loved, too broken to be seen, too flawed to be royal. Let every future heir walk not only in lineage, but in humility. For the measure of a crown lies not in its jewels, but in its justice. And justice at long last belongs to them. Through the hush, through the hurt, they endure, not beneath royal titles, but above them, remembered, restored, sovereign in spirit at last. No heralds, no hymns, just the weight of history finally shifting. These children abandoned, hidden, misnamed, become more than forgotten heirs. They are the unfinished symphony of a monarchy's conscience. In remembering them, we don't rewrite the past, we reveal it, not to vilify, but to illuminate, because their stories are our stories too. In every child secluded for being different, in every family shamed into silence, their legacy lingers. So here at the end we begin, with truth, with tenderness, with the ache of knowing they never heard their names spoken with pride. We speak them now not as myths, not as martyrs, but as reminders that no lineage is sacred if it silences its own, that no throne is worth more than a child, and that memory itself can become a crown, one that fits all, even those they tried hardest to forget. And with that final truth, the dust settles, not over graves, but over secrets finally uncovered. These children's lives, once buried beneath layers of protocol and performance, rise like soft embers of dignity long denied. From the cold corridors of imperial estates to the locked wards of forgotten hospitals, their presence endures a constellation of lost stars now mapped into our shared sky. We cannot crown them with gold, nor restore the years stolen by silence, but we can give them what power withheld: a name, a space, a chapter. We cannot change what they endured, but we can decide what they mean. They lived, they mattered, and in recording their stories, we restore not only their place in history but our capacity to hold truth without flinching. So let this be the closing line, not of a tragedy, but of a testimony, one that history, no matter how regal, can no longer unwrite. They are royal, at last, not by decree but by memory. So here ends their long walk from shadow to light, not because justice was rendered, but because remembrance refused to be silenced. These stories, once stifled by velvet protocol and buried beneath royal decorum, now breathe again, aching, flickering, stubborn. They are not simply tales of past cruelty, but tools for present clarity, for in each name recalled, each truth revived, we reclaim more than history, we reclaim our humanity. The tragic fate of royal children born with Down syndrome should never have been a footnote, but now, raised into the narrative with honor, they remind us what kind of world we aim to build, one where no life is edited out to preserve appearance, where memory replaces myth, and where power at last bends not to fear, but to love. The crown, however grand, holds no glory without the courage to include, and in that courage their reign is quietly, gloriously restored. Let us walk away not with pity, but with purpose. These children's stories do not ask us to weep forever, but to see clearer, to understand that behind every throne there is a mirror, and what we choose to see in it defines us far more than any dynasty ever could. The veil of royalty, for all its splendor, cannot conceal the simple truth that love unspoken is still love lost, and that silence, however gilded, corrodes even the proudest heritage. As gates close behind the final echoes of their stories, we are left not with grandeur, but with grace, the quiet, unshakable kind that comes from recognizing humanity in its most vulnerable form. These children were royal not because history says so, but because dignity makes it so. And now, as their light touches the pages once kept blank, we know this: they were never the error in the lineage. They were the missing chapter in the legacy of truth. So, as the final candle dims in this long, sorrowful procession, we leave not behind a tale of royal shame, but an invitation to remember persistently, profoundly, personally. These children, once hidden in the folds of velvet curtains and misfiled ledgers, now stand at the edge of our consciousness, waiting to be welcomed home, not as relics of scandal, but as souls whose erasure only underscores the fragility of our collective memory. Their story, once silenced by decree, now grows louder with every listener who refuses to look away. We cannot undo their pain, but we can ensure it echoes with meaning. Let this not be a closing, but a commitment. In courtrooms or classrooms, in banquets or bedtime stories, let their truth endure, not as a whisper behind closed doors, but as a declaration etched into the conscience of time. No child born into this world, royal or otherwise, should vanish in silence. Their lives mattered, their memory is royal, forever. And perhaps that is where this story must end, not with sorrow, but with vigilance. In every hush that follows the last note of this requiem, may there be resolve to listen harder, to look deeper, to question the perfection sold in pageantry. For the children erased not by accident, but by intent, deserve more than belated grief. They deserve guardians of memory, sentinels of truth. Whether tucked in the corner of an old portrait gallery or hidden between euphemisms in dusty medical notes, their legacy lingers, asking not for crowns, but for conscience. This is not merely their burden, it is ours now, to tell the stories that power tried to hide, to honor the lives withheld from daylight, and to promise, silently but fiercely, that never again will we measure worth by symmetry or silence, not in royalty, not anywhere. To remember is to resist is to heal, and in healing, their stolen place in history is finally irrevocably restored. So let this be the final breath drawn in their name, a quiet vow amid the ruins of magnificence. The tragedy of their lives is not just that they were hidden, but that the world allowed their silencing to sanctify a false idea of purity. But now, with their truth uncovered, the illusion cracks. Let each listener carry forward their story, not as a burden, but as ballast, keeping history from drifting once more into the comforting fog of erasure. The duty now lies with us to teach our children not only of kings and queens, but of those the throne refused to name, to ensure every silence is questioned, every absence remembered. This is the end of forgetting, and the beginning of a new kind of memory, one shaped not by lineage but by love, not by legacy but by light. They were born royal, and at long last, their crown is memory, eternal and unbroken. Their crown is memory, eternal and unbroken, and it shines not in museums or marble halls, but in the simple act of bearing witness. We have journeyed through velvet-wrapped silences and cold corridors of denial to arrive here, in the vast quiet of truth. The tragic fate of royal children born with Down syndrome is more than a tale of erasure. It is a challenge to every story we continue to tell about power, privilege, and perfection. These children were not deviations from greatness. They were the measure of our humanity. Whether a forgotten prince in Austria or a misnamed niece in England, each represented a choice by families, nations, histories between appearance and acceptance. That choice was made in silence. But here, at the end, we choose differently. We choose to hear, to see, to speak, and in that speaking we lift a crown not of gold or tradition, but of truth finally, fully, and forever theirs. So now, the final curtain must fall not in silence, but in reverence. These were not just stories, they were reckonings. Not just children lost to privilege's blindness, but compass points guiding us toward a gentler world. With each name unburied, each truth spoken aloud, we reclaim a history that had buried feeling for form, truth for tradition. And as we close this journey, let us carry forward not just their memory, but their message, that dignity does not depend on lineage, that worth is not derived from flawlessness. They lived quietly, painfully, invisibly, but now they live again in the hearts that hold them, in the voices that name them, in a world where remembrance becomes revolution. No crown could contain their grace. No legacy is complete without their light. And so, in the hush beyond this final word, their stories remain not as shadows of shame, but as monuments of truth, eternal, unbroken, royal. And so, let us leave the echoing chambers of history not with bowed heads, but with open hearts. The children once hidden behind names never spoken, behind doors never opened, have found their way to us not through royal declarations, but through the silence they defied. They teach us that history is not a gallery of portraits, but a collection of choices, some cruel, some cowardly, some redemptive. In remembering them, we reclaim the moral weight of memory itself. We refuse to let pageantry erase pain. We declare, in the quietest way possible, that their lives mattered, that their stories endured. And though they may never have worn coronets or stood on palace balconies, they shaped the soul of history with their resilience. So let this final truth carry us forward. Remembrance is not an act of nostalgia, it is an act of justice. Their legacy is not silence, it is the sound of being seen, at last, forever royal in the heart of history. And in that radiant final act, we do not just remember they reign, not above us, not beneath us, but beside us, as part of a fuller telling of who we are and who we must become. Their story is no longer a shadow in the margins, but a shining truth that reshapes the center. Let the palaces keep their pageantry. We have chosen something far more enduring, to speak the unspeakable, to remember the unremembered, to love those once deemed unlovable by institutions too afraid to embrace their own humanity. This is where the silence breaks, where the crown is passed, cradled not in gold but in grace. For in every whispered name, every unspoken lullaby finally sung, we remember not just who they were, but who we must be. And that, above all thrones and titles, is what makes their memory invincible, indivisible, and endlessly royal. So let the final words linger gently, like the breath of a lullaby never finished. Let them wrap around the names that power cast out, and draw them near, not as ghosts, not as regrets, but as truths fully formed. Every monarchy that shadowed a child with shame must now face the fragile, furious light of remembrance. For nothing, no crown, no constitution, no custom outweighs the simple dignity of being seen. Their stories have crossed centuries to reach us, not to beg, but to belong. And now that they stand beside us in memory and in purpose, there is no need for grandeur, no call for procession. Only this, a world that no longer hides its most tender truths behind velvet. They were born royal not because the world crowned them, but because their humanity did. And now, as history takes its final bow, their reign begins, steadfast and sovereign, in the purest court of all our conscience. Let this be the closing of myth and the opening of meaning. The veil has lifted. The names once erased now echo in corridors once deaf to their presence. Their royalty was never in titles, but in truth in the quiet strength to survive a world that refused to see them. And now, we do. With every page turned, every silence filled, we become the stewards of their legacy, not one built on silver and silk, but on the enduring flame of human worth. They are not footnotes, not forgotten. They are the first chapter in a future where no child is hidden to preserve the illusion of perfection. So we hold them boldly, fiercely, lovingly, not behind us as shadows, but before us as beacons, not as a tragedy closed, but as a truth lived forever. Royalty, reborn not in blood, but in memory, not in silence, but in song, and we, at last, remember. So now, we close the book not with finality, but with fidelity. Fidelity to those whose lives were softened into secrecy, trimmed from memory to fit a mold no soul could ever truly wear. Their royalty was lived in the resilience of breath denied its name, in lullabies swallowed by silence. But silence no longer holds dominion here. With each voice that dares to speak their truths, each listener who chooses to remember, a new kind of monarchy is born, not bound by blood, but by love, by truth, by reverence for every life once left in the shadows. These children, once erased, now endure not behind crests, but within hearts. Their crowns are not visible, but they gleam nonetheless, incandescent with dignity. And as we carry their stories forward, let our memory not be passive, but powerful. For history, when woven with truth, has the strength to heal. This, then, is their legacy, not silence, song, not shadow, sovereignty.